When I was about 7, I was completely obsessed with this little raccoon that lived in the woods near our house. I named him Bandit because, obviously, he looked like he was wearing a mask. Every day after school, I'd sneak him scraps of food, apple cores, crusts of peanut butter sandwiches, and once, an entire piece of leftover steak I smuggled out of the fridge. My parents weren't thrilled about me feeding wild animals, but they didn't stop me either. They just made me promise not to touch him because raccoons can have rabies. Bandit and I became best friends. At least, in my mind. He'd wait near the edge of the woods every day, and when I came out, he'd scurry closer and sit there, staring at me while I talked to him like he was a person. I even tried teaching him tricks once, but all he did was grab the food and bolt. I thought he was the coolest thing in the world. One day, Bandit didn't show up. I went to the woods and called for him, even brought a hot dog I'd stolen from the fridge, because Bandit deserved the best. Still no sign of him. I was devastated. I cried so much that my dad finally caved and said we could go looking for him. That evening, we walked into the woods, me clutching my flashlight and calling Bandit's name like a lunatic. After a while, I saw something up ahead, a flicker of movement in the bushes. I sprinted toward it, yelling, "Bandit! I found you!" But when I got there, I froze. Bandit was there, sort of. Except he wasn't sitting up or waiting for food. He was sprawled out on the ground, not moving. I started crying again, assuming he'd gotten sick or hurt. My dad walked over, knelt down, and stared at Bandit for a long time. Then, without saying anything, he picked me up and said, "We're going home." I didn't understand. I begged him to help Bandit, but he wouldn't even let me go near him. I was heartbroken. It wasn't until years later, after I brought up Bandit at Thanksgiving, that I got the full story. My dad sighed and said, "I wasn't going to tell you this, but that raccoon wasn't your Bandit." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. He looked at me and said, "That raccoon wasn't dead when we found it. It had been skinned. Apparently, some guy in the area had been poaching animals, and my Bandit had been one of his victims. When we found him, the poor raccoon was still breathing, lying there without his fur. My dad didn't tell me because he didn't want me to know that kind of thing existed. Instead, he waited until I went to bed, came back with a shovel, and took care of it. And that's how my childhood best friend became a sad, twisted memory, and why I never, ever let my kids feed wild animals."